For generations, we've been instructed to search for authority in the evident location. Crowns, monarchs, forces, banners, elevated over conquered regions. However, one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe possessed none of those elements. Zero king, zero capital, zero permanent force, zero single ruler issuing directives. And yet, it influenced price, dictated access to markets, penalized monarchs, and determined which cities flourished and which declined. Its influence extended from London to Novgorod, from the North Sea deep into the Baltic. It wasn't an empire, it was a network, a coalition of merchants who discovered something most rulers didn't yet comprehend. If you control commerce, you don't require to control regions. Authority will arrive to you anyway. Welcome to the financial historian, where currency, authority, and history intersect, and nothing exists as straightforward as it appears. To comprehend how the Hanseatic League came into existence, you have to remove the romantic image of medieval Europe. This was not a continent of stable kingdoms and orderly markets. It was fragmented, brutal, and unreliable. After the collapse of Roman power, Northern Europe became a patchwork of weak states, competing princes, city lords, and feudal claims layered on top of one another. Boundaries shifted constantly. Regulations changed the moment you crossed a river, just as depended on who controlled the road you were standing on. For merchants, this wasn't merely inconvenient, it was dangerous. Commerce existed, but it came at a brutal expense. Vessels faced piracy in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans were subject to tolls, confiscation, or outright robbery. A merchant could load a vessel with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port, not because demand wasn't there, but because protection wasn't. Monarchs were content to tax commerce when it passed through their territory, but far less interested in guaranteeing its safety once it moved beyond their reach. Agreements meant little across boundaries. If a transaction went wrong in a foreign city, there was often zero court willing or able to enforce it, and yet the profits were too substantial to ignore. Northern Europe was prosperous in exactly the resources the rest of the continent required. Timber for vessels and cities, grain to nourish growing populations, furs, amber, fish, salt, wool. Demand was rising. Cities were expanding and commerce routes were forming, whether rulers approved it or not. The difficulty wasn't demand. The difficulty was confidence. Confidence between strangers. Confidence across languages, regulations, and loyalty. And confidence in this reality was in short supply. Merchants were left with a choice: accept permanent vulnerability or construct their own framework of protection. The earliest seeds of the Hanseatic League weren't ideological or political. They were practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They shared vessels for safety. They traveled in convoys. They warned each other about hostile ports, corrupt officials, and dangerous waters. What began as mutual assistance quickly evolved into something more strategic. Cooperation reduced danger. Reduced danger meant lower expenses. Lower expenses meant higher profits. And once merchants realized that collaboration paid better than competition, the reasoning became difficult to ignore. Over period, these relationships solidified. Cities that hosted and protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that didn't found themselves bypassed. Commerce routes didn't merely reflect geography. They reflected confidence, and confidence began to cluster around specific ports and towns. Lübeck, sitting at a crucial crossroads between the Baltic and inland Europe, became one of the earliest hubs. Hamburg linked river commerce to the North Sea. These cities weren't powerful because they had forces. They were powerful because they were unavoidable. What's important to comprehend here is that zero individual sat down and designed the Hanseatic League. There was zero founding charter, zero declaration, zero moment where someone announced the creation of a new authority block. It emerged the manner markets often accomplish, organically, driven by incentive. Merchants aligned their conduct because it made economic understanding. Cities supported them because commerce brought prosperity. Over period, alignment transformed into expectation. Expectation transformed into regulation, and regulations transformed into leverage. As these merchant networks expanded, something subtle but critical occurred. Commerce ceased being merely an economic activity and started becoming an organizing principle. If enough merchants refused to exchange with a city, that city suffered. Prices rose, supplies dried up, revenue collapsed. Cooperation wasn't enforced with aggression, at least not initially. It was enforced through exclusion. And exclusion in a reality dependent on commerce was devastating. This was the quiet genius of what would become the Hanseatic League. It didn't attempt to replace states. It operated around them. It didn't overthrow rulers. It made them dependent. Monarchs might control territory, but merchants controlled access. And access to grain, timber, salt, and credit mattered more than banners flying over castles. Slowly, almost invisibly, economic coordination began to outweigh political power. By the 13th century, these merchant alliances spanned dozens of cities across Northern Europe. They spoke different languages. They answered answered to different rulers. But when it came to commerce, they increasingly acted as one, not because they were ordered to, but because the framework rewarded those who complied and penalized those who didn't. This was the birth of a new kind of authority, one that didn't require legitimacy from God or lineage, one that didn't rely on conquest, an authority rooted in logistics, confidence, and collective enforcement. The Hanseatic League wasn't yet a cartel in the contemporary understanding, but the foundations were already there. Shared interests, shared regulations, shared consequence. And as this network grew denser and more confident, it began to realize something even more unsettling. If merchants could protect themselves, coordinate commerce, and enforce standards across boundaries, what exactly did they still require monarchs for? As the network expanded, its authority became harder to ignore and impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Merchants weren't merely cooperating anymore. They were coordinating. They began standardizing agreements, weights, measures, and commercial practices across cities that technically had nothing in common politically. A transaction struck in Bruges could be comprehended in Bremen. Prices quoted in Riga made understanding in Cologne. This wasn't cultural harmony. It was economic alignment. And alignment reduced friction in manners medieval states simply couldn't equal. The League's merchants also began to institutionalize their presence abroad. In crucial foreign cities, they established commercial enclaves known as Kontors, semi-autonomous commercial districts that operated under Hanseatic regulation rather than local ones. London had the Steel Yard. Bruges, and later Antwerp, hosted major Hanseatic communities. Novgorod became a crucial eastern node. These weren't embassies in the formal understanding, but they served a similar function. They housed merchants, stored goods, resolved disputes internally, negotiated collectively with local authorities. If a foreign ruler wanted access to Hanseatic commerce, they dealt with a group, not individual. That distinction mattered because once negotiations were collective, leverage shifted. A single merchant could be coerced, taxed, or ignored. A coordinated network controlling essential commerce flows could not. When disputes arose, the League responded not with petitions, but with pressure. If a city mistreated Hanseatic merchants or violated agreed conditions, the response was swift and impersonal. Commerce stopped. Vessels were rerouted. Goods disappeared. The economic pain was immediate and unmistakable. This was economic warfare, but without bloodshed, at least most of the period. The brilliance of the Hanseatic framework lay in how little it relied on force. Aggression was expensive. Forces required funding, loyalty, and constant maintenance. The League preferred something cleaner: denial, exclusion, boycott. These instruments didn't require soldiers. They required discipline. And discipline was enforced not by ideology, but by profit. Cities that broke ranks lost access to the network. Merchants who violated regulations found themselves isolated. Compliance wasn't moral. It was rational. Over period, rulers learned the instruction the difficult manner. Monarchs might grant privileges, exemptions, or protections to Hanseatic merchants, not out of generosity, but necessity. Northern Europe depended on the flow of goods the League controlled. Grain shortages could destabilize cities. Timber shortages could halt vessel construction. Salt shortages could compromise food preservation. The League sat at the choke points of all three. When conflicts arose, rulers often discovered that sovereignty meant very little if markets transformed against them. This didn't signify the Hanseatic League was universally loved. Far from it. Local merchants resented its dominance. Rulers bristled at its autonomy. Cities excluded from the network accused it of monopolistic conduct, which in fairness wasn't entirely incorrect. The League fixed prices, restricted access, coordinated supply. By any contemporary definition, it behaved like a cartel. The distinction was that there was zero regulatory power strong enough to halt it. And here's the uncomfortable component. The League didn't become powerful because it was corrupt or conspiratorial. It became powerful because it resolved a difficulty zero individual else could. In a reality without reliable states, it provided reliability. In a reality without enforceable regulation, it enforced norm. In a reality without security guarantees, it reduced danger. Individuals didn't submit to the Hanseatic framework because they were forced to. They participated because the alternative was worse. This is where the narrative begins to relocate beyond medieval commerce and into something far more familiar. The Hanseatic League wasn't merely relocating goods. It was organizing expectation. It was influencing conduct. It was determining who obtained access to markets and on what conditions. And once an institution controls access, it doesn't require a crown to rule. By the 14th century, the League had grown confident enough to act openly as a political force. When Danish monarchs threatened Hanseatic interests in the Baltic, the League didn't appeal to higher power. It raised fleets, it blockaded ports, and negotiated treaties on equal footing with monarchs. The conflict against King Valdemar IV of Denmark terminated not with his victory, but with concessions to the League. Commerce privileges were secured, autonomy was preserved. A loose coalition of merchants had bent a crown to its will. Nothing says restricted authority like forcing a monarch to renegotiate. And yet, even at its height, the Hanseatic League never became a state. It had zero capital, zero permanent treasury, zero unified military command. Its media meetings were regular. Attendance was voluntary. Decisions were often slow and contentious. On paper, it looked fragile. In practice, it endured for centuries. Because its strength didn't originate from centralization, it originated from alignment. The League was held together by a shared comprehension. Protect the framework. The framework will protect you. That comprehension proved more durable than loyalty to any single ruler. Cities rose and fell. Dynasties collapsed. Boundaries shifted. The League adapted. It rerouted commerce, shifted hubs, absorbed shocks. It behaved less like a government and more like a market organism, responsive, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on survival. However, this adaptability carried a hidden expense. As the League grew more entrenched, it also grew more conservative. Regulations that once enabled expansion began to resist modification. New competitors emerged. Southern commerce routes expanded. Atlantic commerce began to eclipse the Baltic. States started centralizing authority, constructing navy, enforcing regulation, and issuing credit on a magnitude merchants could no longer outmaneuver indefinitely. The very governments the League had once outperformed began catching up. The Hanseatic League didn't collapse in a dramatic moment. It faded slowly, quietly, as incentives shifted, as alternatives emerged, as the balance between state authority and market authority recalibrated. But the instruction it leaves behind is sharper than ever. You don't require sovereignty to wield authority. You require coordination. You don't require forces if you control access. And you don't require ideology when incentives accomplish the work for you. The Hanseatic League didn't rule Northern Europe by decree. It ruled it by necessity. And that is often the most durable form of control there. If this provided you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.